Hey folks, welcome to the Darkhorse podcast. This is going to be a very special episode. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of sitting today with John Bowes, Dale Saran, and Olivia Degenkolb. So what brings us together is a shared battle over vaccine mandates. They're not the only mandates, but they're clearly the central ones here. And I think what many Americans and many in the West do not understand is that although mandates have largely been lifted across much of the civilian world, they are still quite active in the military. I did want to say a word about why Dale is here. Dale is functioning as an attorney in this context, and he brings not only experience with the law, but experience with past military mandates over vaccines, as I understand it, anthrax being central in that earlier fight. And so that battle over the anthrax vaccine actually sheds a great deal of light on the current battle over the COVID-19 vaccines that most of us are just simply unaware of. So, Dale, I'm glad to have you here to provide that context and also to provide insight on the various nuances of the law that obviously surround the question of whether mandates are legitimate. Do you want to say something about the anthrax battle, how it ended up where it stands now?
These mandates, I think it's important just for a little historical context to kind of understand how we got here, is that the anthrax vaccine was really, well, first of all, it was the first EUA vaccine. So now everybody knows what EUA means, emergency use authorized product. But the first one of those was actually the anthrax vaccine back in 2004. But all of this really begins, at least in the recent history, with the Gulf War. And the DOD, I don't need to tell you about the WMDs, and we probably don't need to cover that history too much. But the DOD's view was that it should have the authority to inject military members with prophylaxis vaccines, give them drugs, a whole bunch of stuff. And that really began in the Gulf War. And everything that's happened since then has just been a continuous march. And it happens to track my career. I was commissioned in 1991 as an officer, and I didn't really know about it. But the Gulf War vets that some of the guys I flew with certainly had stories about, these variety of products. But Gulf War illness, which I think, those of us old enough to remember that are familiar with, out of the 700,000 or so service members who served in Gulf War I, the Persian Gulf War, about 100,000 reported some kind of symptoms that came to be known as Gulf War syndrome. And that really led to eventually to the EUA statute and all of this, but prohibitions on the Department of Defense's use of unlicensed products in operations to protect service members. And where we are now is really just the end state of that march.
Well, there's a lot I want to know about that. I followed for quite some time the story of Gulf War syndrome. I was absolutely struck by, I guess I probably would not at the time have called it gaslighting, but I certainly would now. The idea that many people who served in Iraq were suffering from a recognizable syndrome, and the military and the federal government was simply pretending that it was in their heads. And that shocked me. I remember as a scientifically minded person thinking very carefully about what might have caused the syndrome. At the point that I stopped paying attention to the story, I thought the leading hypothesis was depleted uranium rounds, which were strewn around the battlefield. And my understanding now is that probably was not the cause, and that in fact there was reason to suspect the anthrax vaccine, which was experimental. I'm learning from you now. It was literally the first emergency use authorized medical product.
It sure was. It was the first one granted that status, but that came later in the context of the litigation over the legality of that program in 2003. I was a young judge advocate in '99. I'd been a pilot and then left that, got into a program that turned me into a lawyer, a military lawyer. And my first cases, among my first cases in Okinawa, Japan, were about a dozen or so Marines and a sailor who had refused the anthrax vaccine. And I think having been a prior military officer, I assumed, because my command sort of put in my head that these guys were just malcontents and, non-hackers, and they were just looking for an excuse. These were people who were otherwise, this was their out. And I quickly was disabused of that notion after talking to my clients and some of the folks they were involved with. I found out quite quickly that the program was illegal, that it was an illegal order, which is kind of a strange thing to stumble onto as a brand new lawyer. There was a Senate report done during the Gulf War, when Congress really got involved and started holding some hearings in the mid-'90s. There's a Senate print 103-97, and it's called the Rockefeller Report, named for the senator. But it's called something like 50 years of 50 years of experiments on veterans or something like that. And it was a look, and it had testimony from all these World War II veterans who had been silenced. And that's part of the problem with the military is, and John and Olivia can certainly talk to this, is, the military can make you sign documents, classify things, and say you can't talk about this. And so the very people who are being harmed and having, what amounts to war crimes conducted on them, the man break tests with mustard gas. I mean, there's terrible things documented in there. But that's been nonstop, and you can take that right through Agent Orange, all the way up through then the Gulf War. So
I'm heartened to see people like all three of you fighting this battle. I feel that it is a battle that I'm fighting, and I'm meeting patriots of every conceivable stripe who have all realized that something very serious is afoot. And I think the quickest route to that recognition is the idea that we are looking at orders that any reasonable person can determine are immoral. And the fact is, immoral orders have a special status. For me, that status is codified by Nuremberg, and the idea that the world, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II, it spent a great deal of effort figuring out what one was supposed to do at the point they had been ordered to do something obviously immoral. And the answer is you are supposed to reject the order. So this is a matter that stands above the chain of command. In fact, it is a check on the chain of command. Now, the modern context is clearly very different, but any time Nuremberg is in play, I believe it's an all-hands-on-deck moment. Right? If Nuremberg is in jeopardy, if we're going to forget those lessons, then we are in danger of a new tragedy of history, which undoubtedly will not look like any of the previous versions. But we simply do not want to allow, we cannot allow anything to be added to the list of great tragedies. And this is our warning sign. And there's obviously something about the scale of this violation that is, I would argue, unprecedented, because not only is it being inflicted upon members of the military, it's being inflicted simultaneously across the civilian population, and not just in the U.S. either. This has been a global effort. And so something unprecedented is taking place here, but we are wise to be reminded of the long history of explorations of how effective Nuremberg really is as a policy. So let's bring Olivia and John into this. Olivia, do you want to start by telling us your story, what's happened to you, and how it fits into the context of your career and your life?
Sure, absolutely. So I went to boot camp right after 9/11. Obviously joined the military to support and defend the Constitution. I truly love my country and the American way. I was prior enlisted, selected for the Seaman to Admiral program, which is an enlisted to officer commissioning program. was a naval flight officer on E-2s, and subsequently selected for foreign area officer, which is effectively international relations. I was an Olmsted scholar, so studied in Beijing for 2 years and was recently selected as the assistant naval attaché designate to Beijing. I was supposed to go to Beijing. I actually went, did language training, went through training and, briefed with people, just ensured that I was ready to represent the United States abroad. And prior to the Department of Defense mandates being announced, I was told, hey, we've heard a rumor that there might be these mandates coming, and so we're going to put you on operational hold. You and your family aren't allowed to go anywhere. At the time, I had significant medical concerns. I had concerns both about fertility. If you read the Pfizer, or I guess the Comirnaty package insert, it specifically addresses male fertility, carcinogenicity, genotoxicity. This is Pfizer's package insert. It says, in a developmental toxicity study in rats with Comirnaty, there was no vaccine-related effects on female fertility, end quote. I don't know about you, but, as someone who is a firm believer in science, my background's in nuclear engineering and engineering physics, I'm just not comfortable putting the balance of my fertility on a couple rats, So...
Well, you ain't kidding. I am going to restrain myself from discussing here the particular issues with the rodents that are used for these studies. But let me just say that when I was a graduate student, I'm an evolutionary biologist. When I was a graduate student, I was studying what I thought was just an interesting evolutionary question, which is, why do we grow feeble and inefficient with age? Why do we senesce? And what I stumbled onto was that the way we breed rodents for scientific tests actually results in them becoming extremely robust to toxic substances. And this is a problem that, as far as I know, has never been corrected. So the mice are, in fact, biased to make dangerous substances look much safer than they actually are. So even if these rats were excellent models, you would be right to be hesitant. But given what these mice and rats actually are, your hesitancy is much more than justified.
Thanks,
Further,
Bret.
I would
That's
say
terrifying.
it is terrifying, and the fact that it has not been addressed is mind-boggling to me. I thought when I found this problem that science would rush to correct it because it was blinding us. It was, in fact, causing us to believe things were true that were not, because these animals were misleading. And when instead my colleagues simply pretended the problem didn't exist, it woke me up to what has gone wrong in science, in academia, in the regulation of drug safety, all of these things. But I would also say that there is evidence actually of the accumulation of lipid nanoparticles in reproductive tissue in rats also. And so the whole idea that what we've learned from rats tells us that this would be safe for women's fertility is nonsense. There's reason to wonder about its effect on fertility. And at best, what we can say is we don't know, right? Which is not all that comforting.
Exactly. So, I had those concerns. I brought them up to my chain of command and to my doctor. The doctor kind of blew me off and, said, hey, this is a non-issue. At the time, there were a lot of people seeking medical exemptions and, speaking to their doctors about concerns they had with the mRNA vaccines specifically. And so it took a while to get an appointment. And in that time frame, I learned that, it was illegal to mandate emergency use authorized products, and that the vaccines that were available that were being given not only to the U.S. military, but to the American people were all emergency use authorized products.
So for me, there are certain things about the story of the COVID treatments, including these so-called vaccines, which really do not deserve that term. But nonetheless, there's certain things about the way this has transpired that tell me that we are not dealing with a normal story in which those who are dictating policy are grappling with an understandably difficult issue and they're making some errors, but nonetheless they're doing the best they can. We know that's not the case because, among other things, we know that the risks of COVID go spectacularly down the younger you are and the healthier you are. And yet these policies are persistently indifferent to your own ability to fend off this disease, which goes specifically then, in the case of the military mandates, to questions of readiness. Which is the greater cost to readiness? Vaccinating healthy people and exposing them to the risks of these experimental treatments, sidelining people who have been trained to do important jobs that are involved in our readiness because they have reasons not to want to take these so-called vaccines. The fact that the policy appears to be vaccinate at all costs is inconsistent with the military's mission, and I think obviously so. And, I think your story speaks to that.
Just to paint a picture of where we stand right now this year in terms of readiness, our recruiting is really hurting. In the DMDC data, which is the Defense Manpower Data Center, has put out the numbers on our military total force composition. And if you look at that data closely, you realize that people are leaving en masse after the vaccine mandates came down. So there's a case to say that it's almost directly related to this. In April of 2022, we lost 10,000 people in a single month, total uniformed service personnel in the active guard and reserve. That's the most people in a single month that we've lost in over 10 years. So people are running for the door already. And when you look at the fact that there are 80,000 plus unvaccinated service members, we already can't afford to lose anyone. And now we're saying that we want to discharge 80,000 individuals because they won't take a vaccine. With the data about vaccine injuries and everything else, there's I think absolutely no case to say that we need to get rid of these individuals or coerce them into taking a vaccine that they don't want to take.
Yes, you point to a third readiness issue that I hadn't considered, which is that obviously bullying people into taking these I know they're supposed to be safe and effective, but these obviously unsafe and ineffective so-called vaccines is going to drive certain people who might otherwise sign up to do something else. So we are taking highly competent people like yourself and grounding them after investing a great deal in training you to defend the country. We are driving people who might sign up for such a job to pick another career. And frankly, the military's own data on adverse events says that we're injuring people who would otherwise have been able to fight on our behalf. So that's three different ways that we are harming readiness here. And the question really is, why would we ever harm readiness? We would need a very good reason to do that, given the fundamental role that the military plays. So the idea that something is allowing us to cripple our own readiness is another, in addition to Nuremberg, sets off alarm bells for me, right? Is that even well-intentioned, or has something gotten into our system that is unhooking our readiness because it doesn't really want us ready?
Bret, there's an interesting, I said when this first started, I got a lot of calls because people knew my history with the issue. But one of the first things people asked me, and it included people, like John and Olivia and a lot of military members, particularly pilots. And I've got some theories about why that is. But people all ask me the same thing. They're like, what is possibly going on? You have to start asking yourself, what's really behind this? And I said that whether it was intentional or not, it perfectly split the force into those who would bend the knee and those who wouldn't. And, I don't know what people can draw whatever conclusions they want from that, but that's in essence what the mandate has done.
Well, I'll go one step further. My argument has been that there are two violations of Nuremberg here. One of them is about informed consent. And obviously, we are not well informed, nor are we being asked for our consent. We are being mandated to take these things. and the military is still being mandated even when the rest of us have gotten a reprieve. But the other violation has to do with the question of immoral orders that we talked about earlier. But I would point out that if you have a policy that delivers an immoral order, and then you fire the people who refuse to take it, you build a force that is much more likely to accept immoral orders in the future. And the question is, I mean, look at, I think you said it very carefully, Dale, and I agree with you. I freely admit I do not know what's going on. I do know that this looks like something that is almost impossible to explain as a matter of incompetence or being misinformed, right? Were it a matter of incompetence or being misinformed, as the system woke up to things like the adverse event signal, the policy would get better. You would expect there to be a lot of covering one's ass and all of that. But nonetheless, the policy would change in the direction of reason. We would stop mandating these things for young, healthy people for whom the risk of the vaccine is actually greater than the risk of COVID. And the fact that that doesn't happen, what I've said before is that we have been left with a policy that is actually it's not unreasonable. It is the inverse of a reasonable policy. If you did the opposite of what it asked you to do, you'd be far better off. And it's hard to explain that pattern by anything other than some form of sabotage. Now, again, am I alleging that there's a saboteur? I don't know. I'm not alleging it. I don't know that there is one, but I do know that the pattern matches what a saboteur would do. One thing a saboteur would do is they would screw with our readiness. Another thing it would do is it would try to make a compliant force that didn't ask a lot of questions, right? And so, you know, how many of these data points do we need before we say, look, we admit we don't know what's happening, but we do know it is tantamount to being attacked by an adversary that does not have an interest in our long-term well-being, right? It is doing what that adversary would do. If you imagined that you had incompetent authorities who were interested in our military readiness and thought that they were serving that interest by mandating these vaccines so that COVID didn't render us unprepared, then you would expect upon the discovery that young people are better off fending off the disease naturally than receiving one of these vaccines, which doesn't prevent contraction, doesn't prevent transmission, and carries its own risk. You would expect, even if this cover story was garbage, you would expect a shift in policy that would increase our readiness from the bad policy that was delivered in the beginning. The fact that age stratification doesn't show up tells us whatever it is at the very least completely indifferent to our readiness.
Right. Brett,
it doesn't care if we're ready at best, or maybe it wants us unready. I know that as a scientist, I have been under tremendous pressure to acknowledge the truth of things that I can tell you are not true. Now, I don't know why I'm being told not to do the job I trained for, but that message has come through loud and clear on every channel. Do not behave as a scientist. Behave as an advocate for a policy that I frankly believe to be radically reckless. And I think we can say the same thing about journalists, for example, right? They are being told not to report certain stories, only to say things that adhere to a particular perspective. We could say the same thing about social media platforms, which apparently the executive branch is telling should have a slant in what sorts of discussions they allow and what sorts of posts are tolerated. So I guess the question is, how many different and maybe the worst of these is doctors. Doctors are being coerced into violating the Hippocratic Oath, right? As if they have a higher obligation to this policy of mass vaccination than they do to do no harm to their patients. So at every realm where I see this policy being discussed or debated, everybody is being told, don't do the job you trained for. right? Don't be a doctor. Don't be a scientist. Don't be a journalist. Don't defend your Constitution. And how many of those realms would you have to see before you said, you know what? That isn't incompetence. That's a pattern, right? We're looking at something that behaves like enemy action. And, my feeling, as somebody who tries to be very careful about, I don't even think in terms of conspiracy theories. You have hypotheses. They function just as a scientific hypothesis does. They make predictions. You try to figure out whether you try to prove them false. And in this case, the least terrifying explanation for the pattern of behavior that we see is that our system has been captured by something, and it has absolute indifference to human suffering and death, right?
For sure.
And indifference to the well-being of the nation in the long term.
And this wasn't, I don't know if you know Marcia Angle. She was the director of the medical doctor, first female editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. She wrote a book that came out, I think, in 2000, 6, 8. And she detailed in that book, I think it's called How Pharma Deceives Us, or I forget what the title is, the full title. But essentially the book details, in her role as head of the New England Journal of Medicine, she just lays out that in her view and experience, the pharmaceutical industry the regulatory capture of the Food and Drug Administration by pharma was complete during her watch. And the book was hailed as a triumph, and how wonderful and truthy, and how it told the real truth. And then now if you go look at, you can find articles that are sort of why Marcia Angle wasn't really correct about pharma. And, suddenly Pfizer has gone from being, the largest criminal fine in history to being the savior of mankind. I think it's something like 10 of the last 14 FDA directors now sit on boards for pharmaceutical companies. My favorite is Scott Gottlieb, was 2017 to 19 director of the FDA. He, of course, winds up at Pfizer. And then the Trump guy, Steve Hahn, comes in from 2019 to 21. In January of 2022 or 2021, he approves Spikevax. Less than 6 months later, in June, he's sitting on the board of directors for the company that owns Moderna. So, 42% of the vaccine regulatory budget for enforcement, 42% of it is paid for by user fees from the pharmaceutical industry. So if I paid 42% of your salary, you're a regulator. How can you how do we pretend that this is all okay? It's as bad as you could possibly imagine. It would be like the SEC having a stock portfolio. You wouldn't think that was what could go wrong. And yet here we are. Those are all matters of public record.
For whatever reason, the policies that are so devastating here are being advanced most aggressively by what I call the blue team, the Democratic Party, of which I've been a lifelong member, but I can't even recognize that party now. And so if you were interested in keeping that party in power so that it could continue to advance bad policy, but you also were interested in degrading military readiness, then the mandates might persist in the military while they are withdrawn in advance of midterm elections or something like that in the civilian population. I hear myself saying that, and I know how it sounds. On the other hand, I'm a scientist, and what I do is I look at patterns and I eliminate potential explanations based on the fact that they don't fit until we're down to a small number of explanations that might underlie the pattern. And in this case, that is a very unfortunate process that points in a direction that I think ought to alarm every American.
Yeah, 100%.
I must say, this is the part of it that is hardest for me to understand, is that I don't think there's anything especially new about the idea of regulatory capture. It's a well-known phenomenon. Pharma is known to be among the worst cases of this phenomenon. It's been thoroughly academically documented. This is one thing when we're dealing with the civilian population. I mean, it's jaw-dropping, and I struggle to find words to even encapsulate how terrifying it is to watch this thing, not even interested in vaccinating as many people as will accept it, but strong-arming people into it. But this becomes so much more dangerous when it's the military to whom we are doing this, because the role the military plays in preserving this system.
You know, the group that I represent, I thought it would be helpful in mass, but there are, I think if we were our own Air Force, we would be the 16th largest Air Force in the world. Like, just my clients would be the world's 16th largest Air Force. We have, between pilots, crew, we've got heavy lift, C-5 pilots, C-141 pilots, C-130 pilots, the entire aircraft range. We've got V-22 Osprey pilots in the Marine Corps. We've got F-35 pilots. We've got crew chiefs, load masters. I mean, I represent qualitatively almost a battalion level, of officers and enlisted who all know this is wrong, and they're all getting the boot. It's unfortunate.
To be grounded now for over a year and watch my peers and my friends, put on the G suit and the flight suit and go fly and rage around and hear their stories, and it makes me a little bummed out. I mean, it's frustrating and it's saddening, and my story isn't even close to the worst of it. I recently spoke to a service member who was told, after he got a federal injunction protecting him from discharge, that he had two options. He could either get the vaccine, or the military would move him to the middle of nowhere, Alaska, with his wife and kids, because he wasn't considered deployable, and they thought that maybe moving him to Alaska might convince him. He ended up getting the vaccine over that, just because he knew that moving his family to the center of Alaska, it was just not something that was even remotely sustainable. And keep in mind, again, that this is after he had a federal injunction protecting him from discharge. So the coercion's not over. And this kind of sentiment that's directed towards these service members who are unvaccinated is exactly what's forcing people out. I mean, even our own fighter pilot community is leaving because of things like this. Our fighter pilot retention in 2021 was below 30%. That means less than 30% of people who finish their 10-year contract as an aviator are staying in the military. We are hemorrhaging people at a time when we're already 1,650 pilots short in the Air Force alone. And in 2017, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force called a 1,500 pilot shortage a crisis. We are in a crisis of pilots in the military, and that's a humongous readiness issue. And it's policies like this vaccine program where people feel like they're alone and left behind and isolated and attacked. That's making people that are even vaccinated go, you know what, I think I'm going to leave this organization because it doesn't seem to represent my values, or it doesn't seem to care about me. And I would encourage the civilian population and all the viewers to start speaking up about that, because that kind of sentiment is exactly how our military crumbles. And in a time like today with China and Ukraine and Russia, that's a dangerous precedent to set for our military when we need every single service member possible. I worked with 350 unvaccinated pilots to generate a grassroots, if you will, study on exactly what those pilots mean to our national security. And in that study of 352 pilots, which is only about half of the unvaccinated pilots that I'm aware of in the Department of Defense, they are worth $7.8 billion in tax money. And that's including salary and training costs and everything else. That's only 350, and that's $7.8 billion. That's a big number. And the average years of service of those pilots is 14 years. So we're not standing to lose younger, inexperienced pilots like myself. We're standing to lose extremely experienced aviators with deployments and actual combat experience overseas. And that's not something that you can just recruit in and fix the problem immediately as a military. So these are extremely valuable people. I also helped to generate a congressional injury report that talks about and has medical data from service members who have been injured by the vaccine. And some of those injuries include a fighter pilot who got pericarditis, has been grounded for 7 months. There was one enlisted service member that had 4 strokes after getting the vaccine. And so these are serious injuries.
Maiming and injuring people who are perfectly capable of fending off. I mean, I believe COVID is a serious disease. Let's be clear about that. But young people who are healthy are perfectly capable of fending off COVID naturally. It is their best option. And these so-called vaccines have such a powerful risk profile that there is no medical argument for this, right? And, I think you've done a good job of exploring all of the various ways that this impinges on our readiness. There's the financial investment, there's the risk to pilots. You point out something I had missed, which is that you're losing the experienced pilots who are obviously essential. We have an obvious travesty of justice and a hazard to the nation's military readiness. Where is the uprising in Congress that forces the federal government to relent?
There's discussion, and certainly as a lawyer working on a lot of these cases, we've had some discussions with Senator Johnson's office and a lot of these folks. But, we're going to have to find a way out of this in the courts, I think, or, because I don't see how that's going to come through a House or a Senate that's divided and,
You're being too easy on them.
Oh, no. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying I don't expect help.
I don't expect it either, but that is people falling down on their obligation to their nation, to the oath that they took, to their fellow man, to their fellow citizen. The fact is, many of us, and I include myself here, have taken very substantial risks to say the right things. That is to say, to explore this issue honestly and expose what is taking place. And the costs have been high for many of us. I mean, as this group of people can illustrate, and, as you all know, for each one of you sitting here, there are dozens of others with stories of what they've faced. So I expect more of these people, to the extent that President Biden has overseen a mandate that has been a disaster. Of course, the right thing for him to do is to give a hell of a speech to that effect, right? Of course, that's the right thing to do. And I would respect him a great deal more if he did that rather than keep doubling down on a bad policy that's killing people.
For me, 20 years, you're going to see some crazy stuff. And in the past, I've actually witnessed other violations of law. What I found striking is in the past, when we would uncover some sort of some action that was either illegal or, discriminatory, or there was something wrong that was going on, leadership had a genuine interest in what was occurring, and they sought to resolve that issue as quickly as possible. It was an all hands on deck effort. There was absolute transparency. We brought in lawyers or whoever we needed to bring in to ensure that the wrongs that were occurring were remedied immediately. That hasn't been the case for anything related to COVID-19. So, as I said earlier, my family and I, we were headed out to China to go be diplomats, and when we were grounded, our stuff, our household goods had already been packed out. So everything we owned, all of our worldly possessions had been put into boxes and were put in a warehouse here in DC. And we're just waiting for, us to arrive in China so that they could send our stuff overseas. Our household goods were held for an entire year before the military agreed to release them. And anytime I would ask about it, I was kind of told, well, you know how to get your stuff. Medical's right down the road. And that was with a religious accommodation pending. Absolutely illegal, not something that you can do. That was just one example of the sort of, challenges that I've personally faced. I've had training canceled or denied. I've had leave chits, requests for vacation denied. I didn't get to go to one of my daughter's medical appointments, to my sister's baby shower when things were really stressful. I'd been told I've been told that I was going to get kicked out of the military 2 weeks prior to my 20 years. And I had several people that I know kind of pull me to the side and say, are you really, really willing to risk your retirement over this? Most recently, I've received an adverse fitness report that's like a performance evaluation in the civilian world. I am being recommended for a board of inquiry based on not taking 2 emergency use authorized COVID-19 tests. So, the vaccines aren't the only emergency use authorized products out there. COVID tests and face masks are also emergency use authorized products, and they have the same legal protections that we discussed earlier. Americans, to include service members, have the right to accept or refuse these products at any time. And I was also kicked out of my command, and I'm actually, in the middle of going to a new command right now. And all of that was for speaking up at a town hall at the agency I worked for and questioning the legality of it. One of the points I made, I keep hearing from DoD, Department of Defense Leadership. I apologize. I'll try not to use acronyms. It's a language in and of itself in the military. One of the things
DoD we've got. I agree. You can leave us in the dust pretty easily, but DoD we've got.
So, I'd questioned the DoD mandates, and one of the things that I keep hearing from senior military leaders is that they're just following policy. And one of the things that I like to point out is that policy never trumps law. Certainly not the Constitution. And then B, DoD policy has been wrong in the past, and I like to remind people, we used to have don't ask, don't tell. We didn't allow African Americans in the service. We didn't allow women in the service. And now in hindsight, we look back and we realize that those policies were misplaced. And I just ask people, at the point now where the President of the United States has stated that we no longer are in a crisis, COVID is not an emergency anymore. I think he said the pandemic was over specifically. Why is it that we continue to drive out all of these service members, coerce people, take these negative actions against each of our service members? And again, we're talking about over 80,000 people here, people who want to serve their country, people who are actively trying to support and defend the Constitution in taking the actions that we're taking right now. The punishment that's being inflicted on our service members is unacceptable and really disturbing.
Really, this all began for me in September of 2021. If I remember correctly, September 21st, 2021, I was called into my commander's office and I was told, the mandate's here. I know you don't want to get the vaccine. You've expressed that to me. And you said you're going to apply for religious accommodation. So here's your option. You either apply for a religious accommodation or a medical exemption, or you get the vaccine. And that in and of itself is fine. That's within the realm of the legal structure and the regulatory structure of the military, is affording the option to get an exemption for the vaccine if there's a mandate. And so I applied for a religious accommodation, but there was a catch. And that catch was, well, if you apply for religious accommodation, you're going to be grounded and you're no longer going to be able to train in the F-16. And that is where the issue kind of begins, because the Air Force's own policies on religious accommodation say that no adverse training decisions can be made based off of the application of a religious accommodation. So it was immediately contrary to the Air Force's own policies in this. I requested that religious accommodation. I was grounded, and then I immediately filed an equal opportunity complaint against my command for grounding me over that. And to this day, a year later now, I have still not heard anything about that equal opportunity complaint. Even though I cited all the policy, I've had no communication and no adjudication of that complaint, which is concerning of itself, that the equal opportunity program is either that backed up or is somehow burying my paperwork. I'm not going to make any accusations, but I was ultimately denied that religious accommodation, and I appealed it. But what's interesting is in my denial, there were some interesting arguments made about why I had to get the vaccine. And some of those arguments included, well, you would have to wear a mask if you were flying, and you can't wear a mask when you're flying an F-16. And that's strange because masks have never been required for air crew in any capacity whatsoever. And I assume they mean like an N95 mask or something, but I mean, I wear a mask when I fly, and I'm in a jet by myself. So it's, the closest we'll get is like 20 feet away from each other. And that's social distancing. And I'm literally in like a bubble. It's like a COVID bubble, right?
Yeah,
under a canopy.
The absurdity of this is almost incalculable. I mean, this is a virus that so far does not appear to transmit outdoors. You're in a plane alone, and there is no conceivable way that you could transmit this virus to anyone or catch it from anyone in this context, right? What's more, I mean, as if that weren't in and of itself catch-22 level absurdity, right? The vaccines don't prevent you from catching or transmitting this virus, and therefore the whole basis for this is about protecting at best, and the argument is thin as can be, but at best, these vaccines can be argued to protect vulnerable people from severe consequences after they have caught the thing, right? That argument can't be made for somebody young and healthy like yourself. And so the only thing that protects this policy is that the people advancing it don't have to explain why, right? It can't be explained. There is no logic here that could explain why the military wants you to get this to protect you in your plane. It makes no sense. No sense
exactly
at all.
Right.
If the military was interested in you being protected, they would want you not to get the vaccine because it carries risks, and you're better off fending off the disease with your own natural immunity.
I mean, I know John and Olivia know that for every one of them who's had the courage to stand up, there's probably another 10 who just were cowed, were broken because of what the DoD has done.
Yeah, this is the tragedy of it, is how many people, had the objection and the concern and knuckled under because fighting, the DoD is too frightening a prospect. I will say that again, the pattern is unmistakable.
Yeah.
Whatever this policy is, it is not medically based.
Exactly.
Right. And again, I don't know. I can't imagine if you talked to me 10 years ago and told me this sentence is going to come out of your mouth, I would have said, what would have to have happened in order for me to say that? But we have a policy in which we are mandating something that we are calling a vaccine that is really far more radical than a vaccine, that is not apparently based on medical well-being. It's not that it misunderstands medical well-being. It's indifferent to medical well-being. Right. And the idea that policy, whatever it is, whatever its purpose, is so important that we are going to violate constitutional principles like your right to religious belief is absolutely shocking. There is something about this disease, the apparent origin of it, which is unnatural, the result of, at best, scientific hubris, and the fact of this incredibly radical medical intervention, which is bound, Heather and I spotted at the beginning that this was such an unusual way to intervene in bodily physiology that the risks were just almost uncountable. The number of ways this could go wrong was very large from the beginning, even before we knew that it did go wrong.
Exactly.
But the whole thing to me, like, I struggle for a term that isn't, there is something unholy about this, right? Again, I'm not a religious person, but the idea that someone thinks that I might be or you might be required to accept this intervention, despite the fact that it doesn't actually work epidemiologically to prevent the spread of the thing, right? If it did, the question might be somewhat different, but it doesn't. And yet somebody would tell us that we are required to accept this, and that our sincerely held belief that it is the wrong thing to do is immaterial, is shocking. It's shocking. I'm pretty close to what would have been called a secular humanist, or is called a secular humanist. From the point of view of what I believe to be true, I'm definitely science first, right? I believe that values have a different status, but science is my guiding light from the point of view of what is and is not true. And even from that perspective, am I allowed, if I was working in a university still, would I be allowed to opt out of these so-called vaccines on the basis that I understand how immunity works, that I believe more strongly in my body's ability to fight this virus based on ancient capacities that I have on board, rather than a radical new technology in which a corporation decides that it wants to conscript my cells into becoming factories for a protein that is known to be physiologically dangerous. It seems to me that I am well within my rights to say, actually, I believe that my immunity is better than that plan. The funny thing is, I think the more you understand about these particular so-called vaccines, the more obvious it becomes that you have a fundamental right to object, right? I mean, to the extent that we were told initially that, oh, what these do is they introduce some mRNAs into your cells and your cells produce some proteins and the mRNAs get broken down pretty quickly, right? That was bullshit, right? They actually modified the mRNAs with what are called pseudouridines. And while nature does this occasionally, they did it absolutely across the entire mRNA, which makes it incredibly durable, right? This is not a natural entity at all. And my body doesn't know how to deal with it because it has no history with such a thing, right? My ability to say, you know what, that's a really dumb plan, right? I may regard you as clever for inventing it, but I know you're not ready to inject that into a human being, right? It's not ready for that. You haven't tested it in a way that will tell you how that will go wrong. And until you do, I want no part of it. That's a perfectly straightforward argument for me to make that I couldn't make at the beginning of this, because the evidence that they had done this to the mRNAs was so thoroughly buried in the heap of garbage that they handed us, right? We had to figure out that this was going on, that their story that, oh, well, you've got lots of mRNA in your body and this is just another one and it's short-lived, that was nonsense they wanted us to believe because it made this seem less radical than it was. So at some level, what I would say is there are dozens of different beliefs that one might hold, stretching from, epistemological considerations about how the universe came into being, straight to basic human biology, right? There are dozens of different beliefs that would support a rational objection to taking these things into one's body. And the idea that something has decided that it knows better than all of those objections and is therefore in a position to mandate these things, in spite of the fact that, I keep marveling at the fact the entire logic of the mandates is about the control of the pandemic. Right. But we've known for a long time these transfection agents are incapable of controlling the pandemic. Right. So the argument has been backed off to, well, they reduce your chances of going to the hospital or dying, which is highly debatable. But the point is, that ain't their business. Right. That ain't their business, especially for young people who aren't in significant risk of going to the hospital or dying from COVID in the first place. And so, go ahead.
It's at the heart of one of our claims. You've gotten right to the science of one of the claims in our cases, which is that they're not vaccines, and that, I don't know if you're familiar with the right to die cases that came out of Oregon and Washington State.
Governor Booth Gardner, if I'm not mistaken, was integral to that fight.
Right, and the outcome in the Supreme Court was ultimately that you could not force someone to take a treatment even if it were life-saving. In other words, the Supreme Court said we don't even belong here, but you cannot force someone to take a life-saving treatment. And so if these vaccines that aren't, if it turns out they're a treatment, legally speaking, that means that even if you could show that they saved a life, and I'm with you, I don't believe that's been shown. In fact, I know it hasn't. That's a different issue. But that you can't mandate a life-saving therapy on someone under Supreme Court precedent. So if these are gene therapies, then you've taken paternalism to a level now where the underlying premise would be the government controls your body and you're getting your immune system on a license agreement, Yeah. And so, it's something that we're hoping we're kind of procedurally placed to get an answer on that question. But There are more than just those questions as well. I mean, there's, I'm sure you followed, relative risk versus absolute risk. They broke the control group. There's been no well-controlled clinical studies. I mean, about everything that you could possibly do wrong in a clinical protocol has been done wrong with respect to these products.
Every way the deck could be stacked, we have discovered that it has been stacked. Yes. And yet we do not react with the kind of caution that would be natural in the case that you discover, this many independent violations of scientific principles and law. It's absurd that we do not react with shock and a great deal of skepticism in this context, which speaks to the degree of power that they have over many people. Olivia and John, you have both described what are, I feel safe to say it's obvious retribution that you have experienced, right? The whole idea is, well, if you're going to object, then we're in a position to punish you extrajudicially until you relent, which of course will cause most people not to object in the first place and will cause many people who do object to relent. Again, this reminds me of, my concern that what's really going on here is we are being marched in the direction of relinquishing the gains of Nuremberg, right? If what we're going to do is expose the entire military to a mandate to see who objects, and then we're going to see who can be coerced into relenting and throw everyone else out, what does that leave us with? That leaves us with a force that has effectively said we will accept immoral orders. And then the question is, what orders flow down the chain of command after that has happened?
We are heading to a very, very bad place if we don't turn things around. But your concerns about the military, I share them, and I don't have to worry about like they do. The military doesn't order me anymore. But yeah, it looks to me like that's exactly what this is headed towards, is that the ultimate goal is that you'll have a military that will, once you've bent the knee, it's really hard to stand back up and say no.
That's well said. I find it very, I personally look at Joe Biden and I see a once very competent, if highly corrupt politician who is now so feeble that I don't really think he's in charge. But nonetheless, his recent speech in Philadelphia was conspicuous in this regard too, because what he effectively did was say, come on, can't we all be unified and go after the so-called MAGA Republicans? And as much as I'm not a MAGA Republican, never have been, won't become one, I was offended as an American to hear my president singling out a group of political opponents and effectively, in not so well-veiled terms, argue that they are not entitled to basic constitutional rights like the right to speak freely. I mean, that was the implication of his invocation of clear and present danger in that context. And so, again, it's a matter of there are a lot of dots in front of us, and even those of us who are cautious about connecting them are having an increasingly hard time avoiding the picture that is emerging before us, and it is a frightening one.
We're kind of the boots on the ground in this fight as unvaccinated service members, all 80,000 of us. And, maybe legal and lawsuits are going to be what takes the hill for this for us. But at the very least, Congress can be our air cover, and the American people can be our air cover. You guys can share our story. You guys can even just tweeting about it. I would ask representatives, just tweet about it. It's that easy. To provide us some top cover and help change the narrative a little bit about who we are as people, so we can stop being villains and start being just everyday Americans who are standing up for what we believe in. So that's my plea to everybody, to Congress and the American people, is just share our story and think about us. And if you're a praying person, pray for us. And if you're not, then maybe just think about us. But that's what we're here to do, and that's our mission. And we're not going to stop until we win this fight, and we're set in it. And that's not to say we're obstinate, but simply just to mean that we believe and we stand firmly in what we believe.
I'm obstinate. I'll say it. I am.
Well, you're a lawyer. It's kind of your job. Yeah, that's beautifully said, John. And I will say, this isn't my first fight. And one of the things that each of the fights I've been involved in has taught me is that you are often led to believe that there's some ununderstandable group on the other side. And you really have an obligation to sit down with those folks and see whether what you've been told is true. And what I keep finding out is no, actually, the people I've been told are a threat to the country have a different perspective. They often have something to teach me that I don't know, something that I missed from the perspective that I arrived with. And in any case, this has been a great conversation in the sense that I think it absolutely reveals your humanity. And I think it's going to be hard for anybody to look at this and portray you as villains or, crazy religious fanatics or any of the things that are used to get people, and this is key, to get people not to listen to what you're saying, because that's how they do it. Right? They get people not to listen, to judge before. And this is the basis of the word prejudice, right? To prejudge. They get you to prejudge somebody so you won't hear what they have to say. And then you'll believe, that these people actually don't care that, their resistance to these so-called vaccines is causing other people to die. No, that's not at all what's going on here. These are people who believe this is the right choice, both personally and medically, and that it is completely consistent with their love of their country and their oath to defend the Constitution. And, how can anybody look at that and be indifferent, right? We have an obligation to each other is basically the point. And you all, through your military service, are very directly addressing your sense of obligation to the nation, and others of us in other roles are doing it in different ways. But really what we need to do is we all need to stand up, because there are many signs we are in a very dangerous place. So I thank you all for joining me on Darkhorse. I thank everybody who is watching this for hearing it through, and I look forward to hearing the discussion that I know that it is going to set in motion. Is there anything any of the three of you would like to say in closing?
Just thank you for your time. This has been fantastic and a wonderful opportunity to engage you and your audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate that. You don't need to thank me. I actually really do feel a sense of honor and privilege that you have trusted me with this discussion, and I hope that it catches the attention of people who will not be able to stand being silent anymore and will stand up and defend you.
Thank you, Bret.
All right. Thanks to all of you, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
See ya.